Journey to a land where stories guard the very heart and soul of history's past and tell of a future more glorious still. Walk through the tales of legendary creatures and fables of old, of gods and monsters, and of a people who still choose to believe in magic. Join D.C. and C. Michael McGannon in a Monster Guys podcast presentation for the retelling of both classic and original stories from the land of the Fae Folk. From the dark, the mysterious, the menacing, and sometimes downright hilarious. These aren't just any old stories. These are fairy tales.
Join us for a story titled The Priest's Supper by T. Crofton Croker, followed by a short discussion on the topic, narrated by C. Michael McGannon, presented by the Monster Guys.
It is said by those who ought to understand such things that the good people, or the fairies, are some of the angels who are turned out of heaven, and who landed on their feet in this world, while the rest of their companions, who had more sin to sink them, went down farther to a worse place. Be this as it may, there was a merry troop of the fairies, dancing and playing all manner of wild pranks on a bright moonlit evening towards the end of September. The scene of their merriment was not far distant from Inchigeela, in the West County, Cork, a poor village, although it had a barrack for soldiers, but great mountains and barren rocks, like those around about it, are enough to strike poverty into any place. However, as the fairies can have everything they want for wishing, poverty does not trouble them much, and all their care is to seek out unfrequented nooks in places where it is not likely anyone will come to spoil their sport. On a nice green sod by the river's side were the little fellows dancing in a ring as gaily as may be, with their red capes waggling about at every bound in the moonshine. And so light were these bounds that the lobs of dew, although they trembled under their feet, were not disturbed by their capering. Thus did they carry on their gambols, spinning round and twirling and bobbing and diving and going through all manner of figures, until one of them chirped out, "Cease, cease with your drumming, here's an end to our mumming. By a smell I can tell a priest this way is coming." And away every one of the fairies scampered off as hard as they could, concealing themselves under the green leaves of the lusmore, where, if their little red caps should happen to peep out, they would look only like its crimson bells. And more hid themselves at the shady side of stones and brambles, and others under the bank of the river, and in holes and crannies of one kind or another. The fairy speaker was not mistaken, for along the road, which was within view of the river, came Father Horrigan on his pony, thinking to himself that it was so late he would make an end of his journey at the first cabin he came to. According to his determination, he stopped at the dwelling of Dermod Leary, lifted the latch, and entered with, "My blessing on all here." I need not say that Father Horrigan was a welcome guest wherever he went, for no man was more pious or better beloved in the country. Now it was a great trouble to Dermod that he had nothing to offer his reverence for supper as a relish to the potatoes, which the old woman, for so Dermod called his wife, though she was not much past 20, had down boiling in a pot over the fire. He thought of the net which he had set in the river, but as it had been there only a short time, the chances were against his finding a fish in it. "No matter," thought Dermod, "there can be no harm in stepping down to try, and maybe, as I want the fish for the priest's supper, that one will be there before me." Down to the riverside went Dermod, and he found in the net as fine a salmon as ever jumped in the bright waters of the spreading lea. But as he was going to take it out, the net was pulled from him. He could not tell how or by whom, and away got the salmon, and went swimming along with the current as gaily as if nothing had happened. Dermod looked sorrowfully at the wake which the fish had left upon the water, shining like a line of silver in the moonlight, and then with an angry motion of his right hand, and a stamp of his foot, gave vent to his feelings by muttering, "May bitter bad luck attend you night and day for a blackguard schemer of a salmon wherever you go. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, if there's any shame in you, to give me the slip after this fashion. And I'm clear in my own mind you'll come to no good, for some kind of evil thing or other helped you. Did I not feel it pull the net against me as strong as the devil himself?" "That's not true for you," said one of the little fairies who had scampered off at the approach of the priest, coming up to Dermod Leary, with a whole throng of companions at his heels. "There was only 12.5 of us pulling against you." Dermod gazed on the tiny speaker with wonder, who continued, "Make yourself no ways uneasy about the priest's supper, for if you will go back and ask him one question from us, there will be as fine a supper as ever was put on a table spread out before him in less than no time." "I'll have nothing at all to do with you," replied Dermod in a tone of determination, and after a pause he added, "I'm much obliged to you for your offer, sir, but I know better than to sell myself to you, or the like of you, for a supper. And more than that, I know Father Horrigan has more regard for my soul than to wish me to pledge it forever out of regard to anything you could put before him. So there's an end of the matter." The little speaker, with a pertinency not to be repulsed by Dermod's manner, continued, "Will you ask the priest one civil question for us?" Dermod considered this for some time, and he was right in doing so, but he thought that no one could come to harm out of asking a civil question. "I see no objection to do that same, gentlemen," said Dermod, "but I will have nothing in life to do with your supper. Mind that." "Then," said the little speaking fairy, whilst the rest came crowding around him from all parts, "go and ask Father Horrigan to tell us whether our souls will be saved at the last day, like the souls of good Christians. And if you wish us well, bring back word what he says without delay." Away went Dermod to his cabin, where he found the potatoes thrown out on the table, and his good woman handing the biggest of them all, a beautiful, laughing red apple, smoking like a hard-ridden horse on a frosty night, over to Father Horrigan. "Please, your reverence," said Dermod after some hesitation, "may I make bold to ask your honour one question?" "What may that be?" said Father Horrigan. "Why then, begging your reverence pardon for my freedom, it is, if the souls of the good people are to be saved at the last day." "Who bid you ask me that question, Leary?" said the priest, fixing his eyes upon him very sternly, which Dermod could not stand before at all. "I'll tell no lies about the matter, and nothing in life but the truth," said Dermod. "It was the good people themselves who sent me to ask the question, and there they are in their thousands down on the bank of the river, waiting for me to go back with the answer." "Go back by all means," said the priest, "and tell them, if they want to know, to come here to me themselves, and I'll answer that or any other question they are pleased to ask with the greatest pleasure in my life." Dermod accordingly returned to the fairies, who came swarming round about him to hear what the priest had said in reply. And Dermod spoke out among them like a bold man as he was. But when they heard that they must go to the priest, away they fled, some here and more there, and some this way and more that way, whisking by Dermod so fast and in such numbers that he was quite bewildered. When he came to himself, which was not for a long time, back he went to his cabin, and ate his dry potatoes along with Father Horrigan, who had made quite light of the thing. But Dermod could not help thinking it a mighty hard case that his reverence, whose words had the power to banish the fairies at such a rate, should have no sort of relish to a supper, and that the fine salmon he had in the net should have been got away from him in such a manner.
Well, this is a fun little story about the fairy folk.
It very much is. It was fun to read, too. Being from an older collection of literature, there's a lot of old grammar in the book, and what we would consider nowadays to be run-on sentences. I think a couple of those paragraphs were one single sentence.
Yeah, it's always fun to run across those when you've got about 20 commas in a sentence, and it takes up the span of a couple of paragraphs, and it's just one single sentence.
20 commas, a couple of semicolons.
And you don't know where to breathe. You don't know where to inflect. You just have to power through it.
Yeah, but it was a lot of fun. I like those old stories.
But this little story, The Priest's Supper, is one that kind of captures a couple of different images of the fairies for me. One of them being the image of them as fallen angels. And it's something we talked about a couple of weeks ago in our main The Monster Guys podcast when we talked, I think, about Women of the Fairy Mounds. We had a little bit of a discussion about some of the ways historically fairies have been viewed. And one of the ways is that they are viewed or understood to be fallen angels. This story captures a little bit of that and captures some of the religious aspects of the time and their understanding of dealing with fairies and some of the demonization of fairies in that process.
Yeah, anybody who reads a story in modern day pop culture or knows anything a little bit about fairies has probably heard that iron hurts them. But you have to remember that a lot of them have an aversion to God and holy things as well. There's one story of a leprechaun who actually is physically caused pain by somebody saying bless you when another person sneezed.
Right.
And I think this is another good example where they hear or they smell a priest coming and they flee the scene.
And that story of the leprechaun, I think also, or another one maybe also talks about how he flees the room when somebody just says, God bless us all.
Yeah.
So there's a real aversion in the story to anything holy or what would be considered, I think, a Christian godly person or relic or presence.
Yeah. It is interesting still. Another version of this same story was translated later on. The ending's a little different. It talks about how the priest rides away and smiles to himself because he finds it relieving, I guess, that even the fairy folk are concerned about their eternal souls and the end times and all of that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool to see them in that light as well.
And the other thing that this brings out, which I think is kind of fun, and I like to see this because so often with fairies and stories like this, we get the dark, ominous, and large aspect. And fairies are the wee folk. And we find in this story, we find them as the wee folk, scattering about the hillside.
Yeah, we make it such a point to remind people that fairies are not pixies, they're not little things. Sometimes you have to step back and remember that even though they're still not pixies, a lot of them are quite small and could be cute if it weren't for the fact that they could bite your finger off.
Yeah, or kill you, murder you, or steal your child.
Or kill your dog and decorate your house with it.
Right, which a lot of fairies are known for that kind of stuff. But here we have a group of fairies that are skittering around the hillside, and we see them as diminutive in size.
You see them diminutive in size, and you see them walking right up to a person and talking to them.
Yeah, a lot of interaction.
It's important to remember that a lot of these stories have fairies right alongside human beings, sometimes having casual conversations with them.
Well, and it's like we mentioned in that podcast a couple of weeks ago when we started our discussion on fairies, that fairy tales is where we find humanity interacting with the world of the Fae. And so it's very common within these stories to find humans and fairies interacting with one another. I just wonder all the time what kind of reflection was that of the culture of the people when these stories were being written.
I honestly I'm not quite sure there. I do recall an article by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, writer of Sherlock Holmes, about an instance in his day and age, actually some photographs that people have been all up in arms ever since then. And even at that time, trying to figure out if the photograph was fake or not. But he wrote an entire article on this photograph of a little girl with her friends that were fairies. Mm-hmm. And, he believed in that sort of thing to an extent.
Very much.
Mm-hmm. And it's, it's not so far removed from our time that these were, this was truth.
Yeah. This was a time when people believed in magic. when people believed in fairies, when people believed in gods and monsters all over the world. Sometimes I think it's refreshing to go back to thinking about such a time, if for no other reason, to open up our hearts and mind to story.
Yeah.
Because story is how we survive as a human race.
Which is the point of this podcast.
So there we have a wonderful fairy tale plucked from the history books once more. We do thank you for joining us for these brief discussions each week and these short stories. And I would love it if you would share it with your friends and family and leave us some love on iTunes. Subscribe there. As always, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, The Monster Guys. We'd love to hear from you, love to talk to you more. Continue the discussion about fairies this month. Everybody have a great week, and we'll see you again very soon.